see each other. All right, and we are live.
We're live.
Yay! Good morning, everybody. Can you see
Morning.
me? If I'm looking at the camera, do I look like I'm actually looking at the screen?
No.
Okay, that's weird.
Yeah, if you look at the camera, you're not looking at the screen.
Okay, so give me.
But if you look at the screen, you're not looking at the camera.
Okay. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Midweek Mochas. I realize everybody is in the past because this being the first live stream, no live viewers, which is exactly what I expected. So, want to welcome you all to our live stream. I am Laura.
I'm Chris.
And we are The Owlery, which is our new YouTube channel and website, which is helping people who are homeschooling learn how to embrace it and have more fun with it. So, first of all, I wanted to give a huge shout out to Roger for encouraging us to live stream and just get started, as opposed to allow my perfectionism to, take a year and a half to. Could you turn the AC off?
Sure.
Thank you. Allow my perfectionism to, take a year and a half carefully editing one episode. There we go. I'm in screen. All right. One of the advantages of streaming at 6:30 in the morning is it doesn't kill us if we turn off the AC. Okay, so as I had mentioned in my LinkedIn article, which I wrote yesterday, I had a family member earlier this week post about how they were playing hooky and decided to have PE outdoors at their local ski place. And I had mentioned that actually it is still school. It's not in a school building, but it is still school. And that sort of brought to mind that, one of the first things that people discover when they are homeschooling is how challenging it is to think about, what is school? Does it need to have desks? Does it need to have blackboards? And, the short answer is it can, but it doesn't have to. And I think some of that comes down to, we get our expectations of what school ought to look like, but we don't think about why does it look like that in your, average local public school or private school. So you were the one who taught me about the whole Prussian model of education. So why do we have school classrooms in a public school set up the way they are?
Oh, because it's modeled on it's modeled on industrial efficiency. The goal of the way institutional schools are structured is industrial efficiency. You conceive of educating children as the same as you would, making basically sprockets or cogswells cogs, that you have raw material and you put it through a manufacturing process where you stamp it and extrude it and package it, and then you kind of quality control it and you throw away some of the waste, and then you eventually package it up and sell the end product out, and it gets shipped to wherever it's supposed to go. This industrial approach was honed by the Prussians, which were one of the principalities in Germany in the 19th century. And they used it as a way of taking conscripts, farmers, serfs, essentially, who were being forced into the Prussian military. And they would grade them A through F on various skills, close order drill, bayonet, rifle marksmanship. Well, some of them are using smoothbore long guns, but regardless, their ability to shoot things, their ability to stab things, their ability to march their ability to follow orders without question. And the ranks, the grades that they were given, A through F, determine kind of what units they might be eligible for, or whether they'd simply be cast off. This approach to trying to deal with conscript troops, as opposed to professional military troops, then gets embraced by a whole bunch of 19th century thinkers and becomes the foundation for 19th and 20th century public school education models.
Okay.
Public schooling itself is a very new idea. It's only about 200 odd years old. There were schools that people could attend prior to that, but it wasn't an organized program of state-run education. It was locally arranged education, either sponsored by guilds for craftsmen and tradesmen. They would collaborate to hire tutors to educate youth. Churches, the churches, particularly in Western Europe, really from the 400s AD, around the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, all the way up to the modern period. Churches sponsored schools, universities sponsored schools so that they could find scholars. So there were ways for scholarly minded children, regardless of their class, to be educated.
Yeah.
Wealthy people paid tuition. It wasn't uncommon in the Middle Ages, for example, for the lord of a given manor to hire a priest in to serve the spiritual needs of the manor community, the manorial community, and to tutor the Lord's own children, as well as the children of the younger children of any of the serfs on the manor, so that everyone had a certain amount of rudimentary literacy and numeracy. The idea that everybody needs to read and write at a collegiate level really comes out of the Protestant Reformation and its aftermath, 16th, 17th centuries, but it takes off like wildfire. It becomes this almost secular dogma in the 18th century, in the 1700s, with the Enlightenment, particularly in France, and then what that does in the English Enlightenment. And all of this builds up to that Prussian model. I mean, we're kind of going LA by way of Omaha to explain where did this model of schooling come from. But the Prussian model works beautifully when you try and implement it on an industrial scale. And by works beautifully, I mean you can implement it on an industrial scale. You can build a building, you can stock it with teachers. They don't have to know a whole lot. They don't have to be particularly skilled. They apply a curriculum. Some kids are good, they get A's. Some kids are average, they get B's. Some kids are slightly below average, they get C's. Everyone else gets D's and F's. And you figure out what to do with the waste products of that manufacturing, the D's and F's, down the road. And so in the 19th century, the middle 1800s, particularly in the United States, in the wake of the American Civil War, the effort at Reconstruction led to a lot of, well, how do we re-educate all these backward Southerners so that they will get with the program? And public schooling, mandatory public schooling, became one of the techniques used to compel a population to capitulate. And industrial ideas were all the rage. The World's Fairs start there, the revivification of the Olympic Games, but on an industrial scale. You have the experiments in interchangeable parts and so forth that start in the 18th century, in the late 1700s, but really take off at the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s into the early 20th century. And by then, there are these programs everywhere in the developed world to build these schools that are essentially cookie cutter. We start building houses in a similar way, although that invited a lot more criticism than an industrial model of schooling. And the goal of the industrial model of schooling in the early 20th century, and this is very, very well documented by John Taylor Gatto and several other thinkers, was to produce a citizen who was essentially a cog. They weren't particularly curious. They weren't particularly socially active. And they accepted what their politicians told them. They did what their leadership told them to do without question. And they produced in factories through performing mind-numbing jobs. And they consumed the output of those factories. And that was deemed the model of a perfect citizen that that this process could produce. And so the Prussian model was embraced and then inflicted, and that's what we think of as normal schooling today.
Okay, so a few things that are obvious from when you're looking at one, it's a system that is already looking at a portion of the students as waste product. And this actually came to mind as you were mentioning that. I had a friend of mine on Facebook yesterday. She's on the autism spectrum and occasionally does advocacy, including things like how school is set up in a way that kids who have ADHD, kids who have dyslexia, kids who have a number of neurodivergences fail, not because they're not smart, not because they can't succeed, but because the system is designed with a very specific end product in mind for which they are not well suited. And so they're just deemed failures.
Yeah, and this is this isn't limited to grammar school or secondary school. When I was in law school, we were informed as part of the indoctrination week.
Mm-hmm.
We were on a forced curve. 10% of you will get A's, 20% of you will get B's, 20% will get C's, and then the balance will basically fail out and have no future as lawyers. And that was by design. GE very famously in the 1980s instituted a forced ranking system where every year the bottom 10% of corporate performers, even if they were fantastic, that bottom 10% were culled. They were just fired summarily. So you went from, if you started working at GE in the 60s or 70s, you expected to be there pretty much until the late 90s or 2000s.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, come 1984, 1985, if by the criteria imposed by the new leadership under Jack Welch, you weren't performing, you were out of a job. So here you are, you've worked at GE 20, 25 years, you have no other appreciable skills than working for General Electric, and you're out of a job.
Yeah.
And the timing happened to be for a lot of these guys, they ended up being out of jobs in their mid 40s or early 50s, right as the recession that Paul Volcker engineered in order to kill inflation, the hyperinflation of the 70s, really got into full swing. Reagan gets the blame, but actually Volcker engineered that as chairman of the Federal Reserve, and that policy shift started under Jimmy Carter because inflation was absolutely destroying it. And I bring all that up. It's actually relevant because as we are staring at another round of hyperinflation as a society right now, it's worth considering what are some of the ways that companies are going to try and solve this problem that will leave people who made assumptions in the 2000s about what life was going to be like in 2030, 2035, 2040. How are those things going to change? And so this is not really to denigrate institutional schools. I went to some very strange institutional schools that
that's actually the
experimented with different models.
And that was actually the next thing I thought is that, not every institutional school arranges itself in that classroom with a neat, 4 rows of desks, 5 rows back, four columns, 5 rows of desks. So you've got
it's usually 5. The model is usually 5 by 5 or 5 by 6. So you can get 25 to 30 students in every room.
Okay. So you've got that sort of set of rows and you got a blackboard at the front. And that makes sense when you've got a model where the job is you have a set lecture and you use the blackboard as an opportunity to demonstrate whatever the thing is that you're doing. Otherwise, you pull down a screen and you have an overhead projector that
You
has.
realize you're dating yourself.
Their overhead projectors still exist. They just use different technology.
Yeah, but everything's gone digital. And then in the last 2 years, everybody got sent home.
Yes, but whether you're not, your PowerPoint slide is like sitting here in your Zoom meeting, or it's on a screen on the wall, you've either got a set of set notes that you're supposed to write down to tell you what you're supposed to know about the Industrial Revolution, or you've got someone demonstrating this is how to do the quadratic equation.
Well, yeah, because it's all proceeding from a pedagogical philosophy that children are empty vessels, or the students, whether they're children or adults, are empty vessels, and the job of the teacher is to pour knowledge into them. And then, some of them will rise to a certain level and others will fall below that. And, you discard the bottom third, so that they're just in the way.
Yeah. And there are definitely different classroom models that are still institutional schools, because I remember being fascinated about Maria Montessori, and she came up with a very different classroom arrangement. I mean, starting with, instead of having grades of children arranged by age in single year cohorts, she had them in 3-year cohorts. And that way you recognize that, not every 9-year-old is going to perform like an average 9-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have a few that are kind of advanced. You're going to have a few that are a little bit behind. But if you group them with sort of 7 to 9-year-olds, then you're going to have that older students helping the younger students model, which does in fact happen. In fact, one of the things about homeschooling you'll notice is if you've got more than one child at home,
we've got 6.
You're going to have a case where the older students will help. I have some of my older children, can I do a read aloud for you? Or let me help you with your Latin, or in some other ways stepping in to say, how can I help? And that reinforces their own learning, because the more that they become sort of teachers' assistants, that's not just, them taking up the slack for the teacher. They're actually learning and reinforcing their own education through teaching. And that does, in fact, happen in a Montessori classroom as well, as you have a student who's learned how to do this activity, showing the younger ones, what they're doing with it.
And I mean, I lived through that, because one of the schools I went to was an experimental school. When I was the middle school I went to was very experimental, and we had 6th, 7th, and 8th grade all in the same room. And the room was subdivided into like 4 or 5 areas. And while we still had there was still a grading system, it was a lot more interactive, in that we were given feedback, almost like what an annual, a quarterly or annual review in a corporate job is like, where you've got your sense of how you're doing, and you sit down and you talk with your advisor about kind of how they think you're doing and their objective assessment of you. And you figure out, what do I need? What am I doing well and need to keep doing? What do I need to improve? That sort of thing. It wasn't quite as structured as some of the
I remember reading a few of those when we were reading through. We
got some of the memorabilia.
Oh yeah, well, so someone had saved them, and I actually remember reading through.
My family saves everything.
Oh, they do. But I remember reading, Chris marches to the beat of his own drummer.
That I do, and always have.
And there was that sort of observation. You could see various teachers from your different areas, and observing, where were your strengths and where were your weaknesses. And it was a very different approach than saying, Chris is an average, will only ever be average in math. That's right. It's a very different approach, and it changes the students' relationship to school, when rather than being graded A, B, C, D, F, you're getting this, what are you good at? And where do you need strengthening? And that's a different approach than you're a C student in math.
And so that's part of the thing, is that even among institutional schools, and if you need to outsource schooling to an institution, then that's absolutely what you need to do. There are some advocates for homeschooling who are dogmatic about it, and
we're not.
Our approach has always been very practical. Homeschooling's best for us. We arrange our lives around it. For other people, that's not an option. A lot of people at least talking with my coworkers, a lot of people over the last couple of years didn't really get a choice. Well, your kids are stuck at home, you're stuck at home, and while you're doing school through Zoom and you're trying to work through Zoom, that puts a huge strain on technology resources in the family. And if you come away from this thinking, well, maybe this is an option, um, one of the things we'd like to do is reassure you, just because you are doing schooling at home, um, it doesn't have to look like the classroom experience you had or your children were having up until recently. I went to, as I said, some experimental schools that played with different methods and approaches. I don't think any 2 years have looked the same around
No,
here. I mean,
it's
we started, as you note in your article, when we were tentatively exploring homeschooling about 16, 17 years ago, shortly after our oldest was born. We visited with friends who were homeschooling, and one of them, she had been a school teacher. She was, licensed to teach and had the degrees, and had that very structured, orderly. She wrote course plans, and she wrote, all the stuff that the educational bureaucracy says is necessary to educate a child. And they
and
had
it's more that it's necessary to keep a paper trail.
Right, it's
of
necessary for the bureaucracy.
Yes.
It's not necessary. It has nothing to do with education. It has everything to do with institutional schooling and the demands of the bureaucracy.
Yeah, and a lot of those classroom setups are more about how do you manage
30 kids of the same age.
Yeah. And what you're doing in a homeschool is a lot more like a one-room schoolhouse, where it would almost be more effective to read the scenes in the Little House series about school, or Anna Green Gables, because she actually was a teacher of one-room schoolhouses. And what was she doing? What were the teachers in the Little House stories doing in those classrooms where you've got kids from 5 to 15? Because it's much more like that.
You could also listen to us.
You-
I mean,
we are here. Yeah. And it's just a different way of doing that.
Yeah.
And when we first started, I remember our oldest made a school bus out of a cardboard box, loaded his stuffed animals into it, and drove the school bus to kitchen school.
Right, because every book he got out of the library, every book that appealed to him about like starting school was about, you get on a school bus, you go to a building, you're away from your parents, you sit in desks in a room. Like I remember a Berenstain Bears book. I remember a book about the excitement of riding a school bus. Franklin goes to school. And so when he realized that wasn't going to be part of his life, he recreated it in his own way. He got some markers in a cardboard box and turned it into a school bus, and he loaded his stuffed animals, and he'd push it through the house, and they'd set up for kitchen school at the kitchen table.
Yeah, and I remember that each of the stuffed animals had a personality, and Scarlet Macaw was an incredibly disruptive classroom presence. But that allowed him to not be a disruptive classroom presence.
Yes.
But school was at the kitchen table for the most part, because what I was doing back then was mostly still book work. And
well, we only had the one at the time, and you were still married to the idea of trying to make it look quote unquote normal.
Yeah.
And so, but we had the luxury of you were tutoring one child.
Mm-hmm.
And you were able to work with him one-on-one in a way that becomes absolutely impossible when we found ourselves with, well, all right, we've got 6 total. But I mean, a couple of years ago, let me think. Yeah, a few years ago, we had them all between like 5 and 15, and then you still had a toddler and a newborn.
Yeah.
And at that point, you can't sit there all day with one student and do the book work. You can't even really do it with 2. At that point, my mother always said that when you went from 2 children to 3 or more, and I have 3 younger siblings, so I'm the oldest of 4 on my mother's side. When you went from 2 to 3 or more, that as a parent, you had to shift from playing man-on-man defense to zone defense.
Yeah.
And homeschooling, we experienced a very similar thing, that when we ended up with, 4 kids who needed to be schooled,
Each at different levels.
each at different levels, that was the point at which we were like, okay, trying to do it this way doesn't work. What other ways are there out there?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we've been looking at different approaches, different methods, different philosophies for almost 2 decades now.
Yeah.
Because when we got married, we were like, well, let's keep homeschooling as an option. I think that might be, best for us. We had several friends in college. We were in college in the 90s. We had several friends who had been homeschooled. They were very impressive and really good people.
Yeah.
They weren't just impressive scholars, kind of brains in jars, but they had good personalities, and they were helpful, and they were generous, and they were warm and friendly and very well socially adjusted. And I remember begging my mother as a teenager. I hated school. I didn't mind the education part of schooling. I didn't get on very well with other kids for a whole host of reasons. And I remember begging my mother in the late 1980s, early 1990s. We were living in Pennsylvania at the time, begging her to let me homeschool. I mean, I was willing to figure out how to homeschool myself, and she was so convinced we were going to get arrested if we tried that I had to be in school because that's just what you did. So we came to homeschooling nearly 2 decades ago as, let's at least give this experiment a try. If it fails, then we can always fall back and, find a private school or a public school and make it work. The experiment continues. Our oldest is, basically taking a gap year and then trying to figure out if he wants to go into college or get a trade.
Mm-hmm.
We have one of our boys is very autistic, but he's continuing to grow and develop and figure out what he wants to do in life. Next down, we've got a boy who's very interested in mechanical things, and not just from a cerebral engineering standpoint, but he actually likes putting stuff together. And then we've got 3 more behind who are still very, very nascent in their skills and talents and interests, and they're all over the place. Being able to watch those personalities flourish, being able to create opportunities for those people to become people is one of the benefits we've realized. And along the way, the schoolroom here has never looked like a schoolroom anywhere else. I'm not sure it's looked the same year over year
No,
either.
it doesn't. It's like it's shifted because there were years where a huge amount of it was spent at the zoo. Zoo membership lapsed, but so that didn't happen as much. But we did other stuff. We've always made a point of doing at least a portion of it outdoors. I mean, like I said, like that ski slopes, it's like that's school. Going to a ski place once a week is in fact school, and it's not just physical education. If you're outside in the snow, that's an opportunity to gain physical stuff, which actually does affect brain development. People don't realize this, but doing things that help build the body actually build the brain at the same time. And in fact, if you've got a kid who seems kind of ADHD, get a trampoline and have them do all of their memory work while it's like bouncing on the trampoline. It really does make a difference. Because doing those physical things actually does build the ability to also do cerebral things. But going outside and doing things that are sort of field trips, our school, I know we've done a lot of stuff with online, but different ways, whether it's, we've used stuff like Khan Academy in addition to doing math curriculum that's not online. We've used classes that are like interactive classes where there's other students at the other end of the thing. And
there's Socratic discussion classes that our kids have done, and we could run Socratic discussions, but a Socratic discussion with 2 adults and a child is a lot more limited than that child with a number of their peers on a video conference call. We found some Latin courses that our oldest has been doing that are run out of Italy, and he's got classmates all over the world, all speaking Latin together. Again, but the sort of the key take home is, there's a difference between schooling and education. And if you focus on trying to replicate an institutional school, you tend to find yourself exhausted and frustrated.
Yeah.
Because an institutional school is not designed to play to the strengths of a one-room schoolhouse. A teacher in an institutional school is not expected to know the students the way a student or a small group of students, as intimately as a private tutor or a parent acting as a tutor. And I know it was a hard jump for you to shift from homeschooling means I need to do everything and be the teacher, to, as a homeschooler, I'm effectively running a schoolhouse, so I can hire people, or whether you hire for money or you trade in kind or whatever, you find co-ops and you find a community to help support the actual instruction, particularly shoring up those areas. And we have friends who've been homeschooling, who we met early in our journey, and they were early in theirs. One of them, I remember, she was really into literature, and she had a friend who was really into biology, and so they agreed, okay, I'll teach your kids literature and you teach my kids biology.
Yeah.
And so money didn't have to change hands. They just, hey, let's get together 2 hours, once a week. We'll get together in the morning, and, I'll do a literature lesson, and they can read some stuff for the next couple of weeks. You do a bio lesson, and then that eventually grew into the other physical sciences. And then everybody has lunch and you play together for a couple hours.
And we've done that. We've had, we've done co-ops for, I'm actually currently doing the co-op with some of my younger children with our church. And so the religious education is being done in a much more kid-friendly way, where, you're using things like arts and crafts to reinforce ideas, whether
not the felt banners I grew up with.
Thank goodness, no. But there's that recognition of, physical things. They're going to remember, what is a hermit a lot better if you spend a day making a hermit's cave and eating dried fruits and things, and talking about the lives of hermits and what does it mean to live away from other people so that you can spend time contemplating God. And they're going to remember that much more effectively than they are from a lesson. But, me trying to put together arts and crafts is not my strength. So
that's true.
Yeah. So
that is very true.
But I love doing them, but having someone else who's thought up the activity is where that gap gets filled. We also do a sort of an online co-op where we've got someone who's spending a month teaching them about, they get some vocabulary building, again, a craft that I didn't have to come up with, but that does help them, absorb a new idea or learn about something interesting.
The younger the child, the more tactile the learning needs to be.
And having that recognition of, there's schooling models that just aren't appropriate for an elementary age.
And I mean, elementary age children shouldn't be lectured at, even in an institutional school, but that's all institutional schools typically have to offer, with a few rare exceptions. So learning
to, what you're trying to adjust to is recognizing that there's a lot of moments that you're not thinking of as school because you don't have them sitting down and writing something. And that doesn't
again, school is different from education.
Yeah. You're still learning and
get out of the chair, get out of the house, go explore the world, and spend time with your kids. Help them discover. I mean, we took a family vacation for the first time in ever last fall, and it turned into we did some exploration of some caves. We did some stargazing. We got to spend some time at a couple of national parks.
We ended up off-road because Google Maps led us astray, and we saw a road runner.
We taught the children that you shouldn't just rely blindly on the GPS.
Yes.
So very important life lessons.
But in doing so, we ended up seeing a road runner.
We did like a real live roadrunner in its habitat. It was blue, but it was much smaller than I expected after watching all those roadrunner and coyote
Yeah.
clips growing up. I don't know if it meeped at us. We were in the air-conditioned vehicle trying to figure out our way back, and I was trying to not hit the thing.
Or the cacti.
Yeah, well, yeah, the cacti with the spines long enough to puncture the tires. That
Yeah.
was a story in and of itself. But so life is an adventure.
Mm-hmm.
Education is part of that adventure. Learning is a lifelong activity. And if you have no other alternatives, okay, read a book, fill out some worksheets, etc. But the real fun stuff, where this approach to educating your children really shines, is you will spend time building relationships with them and having adventures with them and sharing adventures with them, sharing the adventures they find themselves in.
And a lot of it actually ends up being kind of stealth schooling, because if you bake a cake with your kid, you're doing chemistry and fractions.
You chemistry and fractions and I mean, if you're doing sourdough bread, you can work biology into that.
That's true.
If you follow a different dietary approach, you can turn that into education. You can turn that into biochemistry, again at an age appropriate level. And I'm not saying that can't be a challenge. It can be,
yeah,
but it's a challenge worth undertaking in our experience. And we've spent the last 15 years actively experimenting. Not everything's worked.
No.
But
and I think that's part of what got to that point where you could look at what does a classroom look like and break away from that, is recognizing that some things.
I was already 1 foot out the door.
Yes.
You were the one who had to catch up on the idea that school didn't have to look like what you remembered.
Yeah, and part of the challenge is figuring out all right. So my one of the ways we like to teach is actually through board games, and in fact we had a podcast for almost a year. I'll put a link in the show notes afterwards, so if anyone watches the replay, they can find it. But we actually had a whole show on how board games are a way to educate.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's everything from, I think I learned place value playing Monopoly. Place value always made sense because when you work in tens and hundreds and thousands, trying to shuffle all of that money around, you actually start absorbing the idea of place value.
Mm-hmm.
But I was trying just the other day to work with geography. Now, geography is actually perfect for games because it's about memorization. Can you remember the names of 50 states? Can you remember?
Fast playing games can allow you to drill things like geography facts and any sorts of facts a lot more effectively than memorizing.
Teaching those geography facts is not necessarily best done through drill.
No.
Because it can be really frustrating on your student of, wait a minute, I don't even know where the state is, and now you're asking me to find it. It's like, okay, so that's my reminder. It's like, okay, I have to start with, here is the map of the 50 states, child, and let's play with the puzzle so you can pick them up and feel them. And now we can play the game where you can find Texas, find Oklahoma, and start recognizing the shapes.
And also, as you're doing the shapes, okay, Texas this is the shape of Texas, and this is where it fits in a map of the continental United States. And from there, the capital is Austin.
It's the second largest in land area, and it's called the Lone Star State. And
you can work those facts in after you get the basics down, and then you do that for all the other states, Louisiana with Baton Rouge, and so forth.
And then you use a game as that opportunity to drill and create an incentive. And that's where you start seeing that, playing family board game night is that place where, not everything is going to be a fact-driven drill game, but there's going to be concepts that they're going to absorb playing it. And you've got that moment of stealth homeschooling where, you weren't in playing, they don't realize while they're playing Wingspan that you're trying to get them to start memorizing the names of birds and all of the different kinds of
habitats, their preferred diets, et cetera, et cetera. Wingspan's a fun. Games are a key to how we homeschool, and Homeschooling, when no one realizes that's what's happening, is really at the heart of the idea of stealth homeschooling. I've run an advanced Dungeons and Dragons campaign for the kids for years, and that's afforded all sorts of opportunities for stealth homeschooling in terms of, can they construct maps? Can they transfer onto paper what's being described? Can they pay attention to clues? Can they ask good questions? Can they make strategic and tactical decisions? Can they plan with their peers a successful mission? Now, granted, the mission is synthetic and simulated. Great, because that means if they fail, well, you just roll up new characters, or you go back and start over. Games allow failure, which is a normal part of learning and living. It's the only way to succeed, is just to fail over and over and over again. As anybody who's been on LinkedIn for any period of time will see, there's bazillions of memes about how failure is the key to success.
Yeah.
But we probably ought to wrap it up.
Yeah.
I think the take home is there's a lot more territory to explore down the rabbit hole. We hope this has been enjoyable for you and that you join us next time.
All right. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next week.